So how many of you guys have heard about neurons before? Okay, Sarah. Okay, that's awesome. So Sarah, do you want to tell me what you've learned about neurons or what you know about them?
Well, I know that they're in like brain and it helps like transmit information in different like parts of your brain. And it also like works on not electricity per se, but kind of.
Yeah. So I'm also going to be sort of like putting up videos on my channel related to neuroscience and neurons as well. But thanks, Sarah. So neurons basically are biology. They are, yes, thank you. Some of you guys are saying it, you know, like little wires through your brain and tiny impulses transmitting data between two places, and it's sensitive impulses, the dendrites, and you guys are knowing quite a bit. The dendrites and terminals of different neurons don't touch, which is kind of interesting. Neurons are like little wires through your brain on tiny impulses transmitting data between two places. Awesome. And again, guys, I'm going to be putting up videos on my channel related to the biology of neurons as well to help you guys. But neurons are basically biology. They are probably half of the cells in our brain. So they're the one type of cell that we have in our brain, and they form these vast networks. So here we're signaling out one neuron. So I'll explain to you guys. But once we learn the biology, we can go into depth and learn more about the neural network. So these are dendrites. These are like tree-like structures. They basically connect to other neurons and form these little gaps with other neurons. So you can imagine that another neuron would be here and another neuron could be here, here, here. Like they're all signaling. And here this is signaling out to another new set of neurons. So the dendrite is, you know, they connect to other neurons and then they receive input from other neurons. So have you guys heard of dopamine? Okay, so that's a happy neurotransmitter. So you guys are saying a lot of awesome things. So one neuron upstream from here is going to release, like from this end of this neuron, that's called an axon terminal. So neurons have three parts: dendrites, a cell body, where it's like basically all the organelles, like the nucleus, mitochondria, endoplasm, reticulum, all those parts that you guys might learn in a cell. It has all of that in the cell body. And then it has this axon, and this axon has an end that's called an axon terminal. So neurotransmitters from and this part sends information to the dendrites of another set of neurons. So the neurons, the axon from the other neurons, they release neurotransmitters, and then those are chemical. They bind to ion channels here. Channels open, ions come inside, and when enough ions come inside, you know, we have potassium ions, calcium ions, all of that. But if we have enough of these ions coming inside the neuron, then the charge inside the neuron could change. And then there's an imbalance in between the ions coming in, the neuron, ions leaving the neuron, there's an imbalance. And then the voltage difference inside the neuron and outside the neuron changes. And once it hits a certain level, then the neuron will trigger something here known as an action potential. So if enough of neurotransmitters from other neurons like dopamine are released and then they bind here to the dendrites, if enough of them bind, enough ions come inside, an action potential is triggered. And then there's a spread of ions that is going across this axon and ultimately results in neurotransmitter being released here and then it binding to other neurons. So I'll just show you guys this quick, small little video of what neurons are. But does anybody know how many neurons we have in our brain? A lot. Yeah, yeah. It's about like, any guesses?
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss the neuron. This is a brain. Estimates vary, but right now the best guess seems to be that our brains contain around 85 billion neurons. The neuron is a nerve cell, and it's the primary functional unit of the nervous system. This is a generic image of a neuron. Neurons actually come in all shapes and sizes, but this is the prototypical version of a neuron that you'll often see in a textbook. The structures extending from the left side of the neuron that look a little bit like tree branches are called dendrites. Dendrites are the area where neurons receive most of their information. There are receptors on dendrites that are designed to pick up signals from other neurons that come in the form of chemicals called neurotransmitters. Those signals picked up by dendrites cause electrical changes in a neuron that are interpreted in an area called the soma, or the cell body. The soma contains the nucleus, which contains the DNA, or genetic material of the cell. The soma takes all the information from the dendrites and puts it together in an area called the axon hillock. If the signal coming from the dendrites is strong enough, then a signal is sent to the next part of the neuron, which is called the axon. At this point, the signal is called an action potential. The action potential travels down the axon, which is covered with myelin, an insulatory material that helps to prevent the signal from degrading. The last step for the action potential is the axon terminals, also known as synaptic buttons. When the signal reaches the axon terminals, it can cause the release of neurotransmitter. These purple structures represent the dendrites of another neuron. When a neurotransmitter is released from axon terminals, it interacts with receptors on the dendrites of the next neuron, and then the process repeats with the next neuron.
Okay. And this is a really cute video. I want to show you guys just a little bit of it. And think of this guy sitting here having some popcorn. Okay, now see how neurons communicate in the form of electrical signals called nerve impulses. So how one neuron communicates with the other neuron. See, this is a synapse. So as you guys are pointing out, the axon terminal of this neuron communicates with the dendrites of the next neuron, and the gap is called the synapse between them. See that, guys? That neuron releases messages at the end of his axon terminal, and then that send a message to the dendrites of this neuron. See, and spreading along the axon to the axon terminal, and then it'll be picked up by the dendrite of the next neuron. The impulse. So that should show you, it's a cute video about how neurons communicate with each other. So once we learn the biology, we can go into depth and then talk more about neural networks. So we talked a little bit about, these three different, types of parts of neurons. Does anybody remember the three parts of a neuron? The three parts of a neuron, guys. Can you guys hear me? Oh, yes, Shayna?
The three parts of a neuron consist of the dendrite, the cell body, and the axon terminal.
Yes, thank you. And thank you as well, Kana as well, like dendrites, axon, and a cell body. Yes, awesome. So once there are enough impulses, so the dendrites receive these inputs, these X values in a way. So it's like a computational unit. Once enough input comes inside the neuron, then what's happened is what's triggered is known as an action potential, where then it's an action potential is a sequentialing, opening and closing of ion channels along here, and then ultimately release of neurotransmitter binds to, to the dendrite of the next neuron, and the message keeps spreading. So this is just the basics, though, of how neurons signal with each other through electrical impulses known as an action potential. You saw the electrical impulse going along the neuron. That's the basics of how we control our muscles, how we think, how we're talking, how we're thinking. So neuroscience is so fascinating. So in reality, you guys had some good guesses, but we have about 86 billion neurons in our brain. So there are other cell types besides the neurons that are called glial cells, and they support our brain. So we probably know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the neurons in our own brain. So we have neurotransmitters like dopamine. Do you guys know how many neurotransmitters we have overall? It was a good guess. So some people are guessing, but we have about 40 neurotransmitters. Does anybody know how many people we have on Earth? The total population? 7, 8 billion-ish. Yeah, we have like a really good guesses. So we have 7.5 billion, 7.8 billion, 7 billion. Yeah, so we have about as of a couple of years ago, we have like 7.6 billion. So maybe we have around 8 billion people. So if you can imagine, we have 86 billion neurons. So we have about 8 billion people on Earth. So if we have 10 times the population on Earth, that's the number of neurons that we have, around 10 times the number of people on Earth. And each single person is holding hands with 10,000 other people, and because each neuron can communicate with around 10,000 other neurons. And we can speak up to 40 languages at the same time. Well, that is the scale of the human brain. Well, how did they figure this out? How did they figure this out? You know, like if you even watch this part here,
communicate with each other, relaying messages throughout your body and powering all of your thoughts and actions.
Neurons. See, neurons exist in complicated networks like these in our brains and our spinal cord.
Neurons talk to each other using both electrical and chemical signals. Messages start as electrical signals traveling rapidly down a neuron. These signals are called action potentials. When they reach the gap between two neurons, the messages need some help to get across. The information is transformed from an action potential into a chemical message, which crosses the gap called a synapse. The release of those chemical messengers can trigger an action potential in the neuron on the other side of the synapse, conveying the message onward. Or it can quiet the message.
Okay, so those are two things. So don't worry too much about the quieting, but I wanted you to see that neurons are, essentially the scale of our brain is about having 10 times the number of people on this planet, and each person is holding hands with 10,000 other people speaking about 40 different languages at the same time. That's like pretty complicated, right? That's like the scale of our human brain. So how did scientists figure all this stuff out so far? You know, our brain is so mind-blowing. So just like how our neuron is connected and sending signals, you know, with these are the inputs and these are the outputs. In any model, what you have is you have the following. You have a function f of x equals some output. But that's a function of the y, right? At y is f of x, right? So if you think of it in this way, there are different types of models. So the idea is people were also thinking, can we come up with other types of models? Like a tree seems good, even the other approach looks good, but sometimes they may not always work that well. If you're trying to learn information from an image, how can you take an image and really put an image into those types of models? The issue is like, hey, how can you actually put an image into like, how do you represent an image? The way that we're able to think and recognize that this is a dog, that's a cat. How does our mind do that? Like I was talking last week to you about how these neurons are signaling to each other. So what people are trying to figure out is how can it all be possible? How can you do all of that? And then they think about how our brain works. How our brain is a set of neurons that are signaling to each other. These neurons signaling to each other, they have a certain amount, these are inputs that come in, and then the neuron, if it gets enough of an input, it signals an action potential that spreads, and then it has an output that it gives out as well. You remember neuronal signaling too? Like how it reaches an action potential, negative 55 millivolts in that case, it triggers, you know, these ions, you know, come in and out, and that's what drives the action potential down the axon to the terminal, and then they release, right? So it's like taking an input, doing something with it, and sending it the output. And then this output, what happens to this output? So those are neurotransmitters that are released, and then those neurotransmitters, then they bind on to these channels, like, you know, these channels along the dendrite of the neuron. And when they bind there, then other ions can come inside. And then, you know, if enough ions come inside in the next neuron, an action potential is triggered again. Yeah. So the idea is get some input, which are those ions flowing in, and then you have an output, which is the transmitters coming out. But that is how neurons are signaling in the brain. Like that's how each neuron is signaling to other neurons. And that's how you can make a model. I showed you a model that looks like a tree. Then you saw that the logistic regression model also looks a lot like, it looks a lot like an S. So it looks just like an S.
Wow.
Isn't that cool? It recognizes humans from not. Then there's another one that you could do, which is to recognize happy cartoons. That could be another project. So the goal is to recognize humans, and then the second goal is to classify them. Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
Not the most accurate, but surprise, he's happy, surprise. You see, like it couldn't detect certain people, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
and if what happens typically is they do you see what they're saying? If it didn't work, why did they say that? What did they say here?
You train 5 emotions. Oh, so maybe those emotions are not.
See, with more images and time, we would have had better data at training, which would improve the results. So it's so important to be able to collect more images. See, if because they may not have, if they had a model and they could label that this person, she looks a little bit fierce, right? How would you describe? Does she look happy or neutral?
Neutral.
Yeah, neutral. He looks happy. She looks surprised. So this is some friends. So in general, what happens is the more images you get, the likelier you'll be able to show all sorts of things to it when you're teaching it, essentially. So usually what happens is that we have these neurons and then they are communicating with each other here in a network, right? Like, so have you heard of how motor neurons, interneurons, sensory neurons before? So you probably understand that in our, whenever we are having some reaction to something, like if we're holding on to a hot plate, there's a neuron here that is feeling the sensation here. And then what's happening is it's transmitting this pain. Like I just made some pasta right now for myself too. So basically I was trying to, it's a similar trick where you have the pasta in and some hot water, and then you're just trying to empty out the hot water in the same pan. And it was so hot, like this steam. I was like trying to hold on and not feel like just dumping it in the sink because there was so much steam coming out. So basically this acute sensation of pain is coming from a sensory neuron that's transmitting this information across. So these are the dendrites that are taking up the signals. They're sending it across the axon. This is the cell body. This is the axon terminal of the neuron. So it's sending it, the sensory neuron is sensing pain, and then it's sending it to a neuron in the spinal cord. So this is like a slice of the spinal cord here. Like imagine if we slice the spinal cord, like, and you're just looking at it from top to bottom. You're just looking at a little slice, a cylinder slice of it. So what happened is it's sending this information to the spinal cord here. See, this is a slice of the spinal cord.
Yeah.
It's sending that information here to this interneuron. This interneuron is like a messenger, an ambassador. So this neuron may get excited, and if it gets excited, it sends that signal across to this motor neuron. So in essence, just send the signal from here to here, like so that your muscle moves. Your neuron needs to send the sensation to your spinal cord, which communicates with another interneuron that sends a message to a motor neuron. The motor neuron is going to then be responsible for your jerking movements. Like if I put my hand over a candle, like why does my hand move back if the candle is on? Do you see that? Like it's all neurons communicating. That's part of how we feel, how we react to things. If you ever feel like crying, but like something prevents you from crying, like someone's coming and hugging you so you don't cry, or somebody else is like ever, like kind of making you more emotional, and like, yeah, and then you're just like, and you're like, you're not making it better, you're crying even more. Or if you ever feel like sneezing and you hold it back. So the idea is that basically how these neurons are signaling is so key to how we are functioning. And scientists and researchers are trying to say, okay, well, we're trying to make a model that can do very complicated things.
Yeah.
And if we can try to figure out how we can do these complicated things, like how do we make cars drive, do self-driving technology? How can we take an image and figure out like your feelings from it? It's almost like some AI came and labeled the image. It's not perfect, but it's getting there. It's almost like, how do you get something to be that smart? That's the goal
Yeah.
of artificial intelligence. So then there are a lot of different types of models out there. Some of them are very simple models. So